Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, how are we all doing? Good evening. All right, here we are. Where's the pen? Here we are for lesson 3 of Outsmarting Anti-Semitism for another wonderful class. And today's topic, we want to dedicate today's class to, in loving memory of Sylvia and Herbert Serlin, dedicated by their son, Dr. Marshall Serlin. And today's class, it's not working. Let's see. Oh, it is working. Wonderful. Today's class is lesson 3, titled "The Promised Land." That's what we're going to be talking about today. All right. So here's the joke. I always got to do a joke. Here's the joke. The joke is like this. A Texas rancher, visits Israel on a tour of Israel, and they visit a kibbutz, and they meet one of the local kibbutzniks, and the local Israeli kibbutznik asks the Texan, he says, "What do you do?" He says, "I'm a farmer. I have a big farm." So the Israeli says, "Oh, we're the same. I'm also a farmer." So the Texan asks Israeli, "Tell me, how big is your farm?" So Israeli says, "No, a few meters by a few meters, a little farmula." And the Israeli says, "And what about you in America, in Texas? How big is your farm?" He says, "My farm, don't ask. I could start driving my tractor in the morning from one edge of the farm. I could drive a whole day, and by evening, I still didn't reach the other end of my farm, of my field, not a farm, field. Farm, it works." So the Israeli says, "Yeah, don't worry. I know what you're talking about. I also once owned a tractor like that." Yeah. There we go. So Israel is such a tiny country. You know, it really is. It's very small, not like Texas, right? We want to talk today about a more contemporary version of anti-Semitism, which is directed at Israel, which is a contemporary issue. And every contemporary issue always means that people have stronger emotions about it. We feel stronger about it, and it's easier for something to trigger us. So God willing, it won't be a triggering class. It will be a relevant class, but hopefully it won't get on our nerves. And let's really see what Judaism and Torah guides us in outsmarting anti-Semitism. We'll be specifically talking about this modern form of anti-Semitism. People hate Israel, let's say it bluntly, right? So what's going on? And I want you to imagine something, all right? Follow along with me, friends. Here's something I want you to imagine. Imagine there's a civilization, a society, a country. And in this country, what they love most, what they cherish the most are carrots. Carrots. They love carrots. They take care of carrots. They grow carrots. This is literally their number one priority in life. Now, I want you to imagine that in this society, there are Jews. And I want you to imagine that if there's Jews in that society, there's probably people who hate the Jews, because that's what happens in every society where Jews are. I want to ask you a question. What do you think the anti-Semitism against Jews in Carrot Land will look like? What are they going to hate the Jews about?
Carrots aren't growing very well.
Carrots aren't growing well this year, and therefore what? What does that have to do with the Jews?
Yeah, there's their fault.
There's no question about it that in Carrot Land, they're going to accuse Jews of disrespecting carrots, violating the rights of carrots, destroying the carrots. You see, if we look at anti-Semitism, there's a very, very simple formula to understand how anti-Semitism manifests itself in every single time and age and civilization. It's very simple. You have to ask yourself only one question. What does this society consider the preeminent authority? What is most important to this society? Whatever is most important, Jews will be accused of going against that. Jews are violating these important issues. That is, in a nutshell, if we want to understand anti-Semitism, that is a perfect formula. I'll even tell you something. If any of you could tell me what the highest values, what the preeminent authority is going to be in 50 years from now, in 100 years from now, if you could tell me what it's going to be in 100 years from now, what is going to be in vogue, what is going to be like, the modern social justice, I could tell you what anti-Semitism is going to look like. It's very, very simple, because there's a very simple formula, predictable formula. You understand? Let's read this text. We'll begin with our text 1, on page 84 of your books. Wonderful text from the lovely Rabbi Dr. Lord Jonathan Sacks. All right, so let's do some reading. Text 1, page 84. Max Newman or Amy Newman, whichever one of you. Welcome, Amy. All right.
Anti-Semitism is not an ideology, a coherent set of beliefs. It is, in fact, an endless stream of contradictions. The best way of understanding it is to see it as a virus. Viruses attack the human body, but the body itself has an immensely sophisticated defense, the human immune system. How then do viruses survive and flourish? By mutating. Anti-Semitism mutates, and in doing so, defeats the immune system set up by cultures to protect themselves against hatred. Most people at most times feel a residual guilt at hating the innocent. Therefore, anti-Semitism has always had to find legitimation in the most prestigious source of authority at any given time. In the first centuries of the Common Era, and again in the Middle Ages, this was religion. That is why Judeophobia took the form of religious doctrine. In the 19th century, religion has lost prestige, and the supreme authority was now science. Racial anti-Semitism was duly based on two pseudosciences: social Darwinism, the idea that in society as in nature, the strong survive by eliminating the weak, and the so-called scientific study of race. By the late 20th century, science had lost its prestige, having given us the power to destroy life on Earth. Today, the Supreme Court of legitimacy is human rights. That is why Jews, or the Jewish state, are accused of the 5 primal sins against human rights: racism, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, attempted genocide, and crimes against humanity.
It's a very interesting formula. It really clarifies how anti-Semitism works. It's a mutating virus, which we, of course, unfortunately, we're all very familiar with these days, right? COVID, we had the Alpha variant, now we have the Delta variant. Let's hope that God should spare us. There should be no more variants. So that's how anti-Semitism works. Anti-Semitism always looks at what is the most prestigious source of authority, and that is always abused against the Jews. That's how it works. So, as Rabbi Jonathan Sacks takes us through it over here, that in the early ages and the Middle Ages, what was the thing? What was most popular? What was the authority in society? It was religion. So everybody hated the Jews on religious grounds. Later on, religious fell out of favor, it became science. Okay, now we hate the Jews on scientific grounds, or more like pseudo-scientific grounds. And what Jonathan Sacks tells us, Rabbi Sacks tells us, is that today, what is the supreme authority? It is human rights, social justice. And therefore, how do we see anti-Semitism manifesting itself today? In the form of a hate towards Israel, with the accusation that Israel is the preeminent, is the number one violator of human rights, of all the values that we stand for in our era of social justice.
So I don't understand, what was the science?
The Holocaust, for example, meaning it reached its peak at the Holocaust.
The Holocaust was somehow science?
Yeah. Yeah. The whole idea that there's different races, that there's, Jews or not. We're not going to get into right now, but yeah. A pseudoscience, but yeah, they blamed it on science. All right. What was that?
Fake science.
Fake science, right? Pseudoscience, right? That's all fake, right? So And this is in general, you could look throughout all of history. What was the number one authority? What was the number one value? Jews are against that value. If there's a society that loves carrots, Jews are against carrots. In the former Soviet Union, for example, why did the communists hate Jews? What was the number one accusation against the Jews? Capitalists, counter-revolutionists. Why? Because the number one thing was the Bolshevik Revolution. So what are the Jews? Counter-revolutionists. The previous Lubavitch Rebbe was arrested and was sentenced to death, and only through absolute miracles he was spared from dying. He was spared from actually getting killed, and his crime was he's a counter-revolutionist. So that's always how it works. What's the number one? And this brings us to today, that the modern form, we could really say, it's not the only form, but one of the strongest forms of anti-Semitism that we are seeing today in the 21st century, 20th century, is accusing the Jewish people through the state of Israel that we are violators of the human rights, which is, of course, the number one value for today. Is it raining? I guess so. All right. Beautiful. All right. So let's talk a little bit about this. I have a question for you, which is an important question. Is every time anybody criticizes Israel, is that anti-Semitism? If so, every Jew would be anti-Semitic. What do you guys say on Zoom? Right? Are we snowflakes? Are we being too sensitive over here? You criticize Israel, oh, anti-Semitism, modern form of anti-Semitism. Let me ask you a question, all right? And if all of you could raise your hands here in the room and on Zoom. How many of you fully believe, by raise of hand, fully agree, how many of us fully agree with every single policy that Israel has ever made in your lifetime? Anybody, any hands? Who could say that they stand behind Israel 1,000%? I don't see a single hand up, right? Am I correct on that? I don't think you'll find a single person, a single Jew, who will say that they're in full agreement with Israel. I'm saying at the end of the day, it's a government ran by humans with flaws, humans who make mistakes. And we are all humans as well. We all have our opinions, and we are all Jews, so we have many more opinions. And there's no problem looking at a state governed by human beings and saying that we're critical. We don't like what they're doing. So how do we differentiate? What makes criticism of Israel anti-Semitism, and what is legitimate criticism? Where do we draw that line? Gail, go ahead.
Would the Black Lives Matter movement and the BDS movement, that would be anti-Semitism to me.
So let's not talk about movements. Let's understand what makes something anti-Semitism. What makes you understand what I'm saying? And in general, I want to stay away from name calling. You know, I think it's important to speak about ideas. Like, and I'll get to you in a moment. You should know that the Rebbe had a line, which is such an important line. The Rebbe used to say, I have disagreements with ideas. I don't disagree with people. Understand? You never disagree with a person. I disagree with an idea. Right? It's never personal.
Those are both against Israel, at least the BDS.
Right. So we want to talk about the idea. When is it that when there's an organization, an establishment, an institution, or even a body of people that speaks against Israel, when is that anti-Semitism? When is that legitimate? Yes, Stuart.
I would say two of the principal reasons are double standards and demonization.
Double standards and demonization.
Yeah, that is when you apply a double standard, when you demonize, that in that context would be, whoever does it would be.
Right. If anybody's applying a double standard to Israel, or if anybody's demonizing Israel, oh, that's when you cross the line into anti-Semitism. Yeah, very good. Yes, Max, go ahead.
When you hold Israel to a grossly different standard than you would hold any other country.
That's right. When you hold Israel to a standard, which is grossly different than you hold any other country to. Yes, Sheldon, go ahead.
When you delegitimize Israel and its existence, and why it even has a right to exist.
You delegitimize the very right of existence of the state of Israel. You're not just being critical of it, but you're totally delegitimizing its very existence. Very good. We have some very good ideas. So I want to show you a video. I'm going to share my screen for all those here on Zoom. We'll watch the video together, and then we'll continue discussing. So here we go. All right.
On the eastern shore of Manhattan Island, the United Nations headquarters rises from a row of colored flags that represent a multitude of nations. Across the avenue, the Isaiah Wall proclaims a Jewish prophet's vision of universal peace. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. The UN's mission is precisely that, to resolve armed conflicts and to foster global harmony. But inside the august chambers of the United Nations, founded in 1945 as a response to a war-ravaged world desperate for coexistence, Isaiah could have easily found himself the target of virulent condemnation had he survived into modern times. Isaiah lived in ancient Israel that for over a millennia included the territories that the UN considers illegally occupied by today's Jewish state. The Temple Mount that lies at the heart of Isaiah's prophecy is no longer considered by the UN to be the heritage or possession of the Jewish people. Indeed, the tiny country that Isaiah called home has become the focus of the majority of the UN's denunciations and has inspired more censure than all of today's tyrants put together. Iran, North Korea, and other brutal regimes systematically kill their citizens or deny them the most basic of human rights. Israel's northern neighbor, Syria, has murdered tens of thousands of innocent civilians. Apparently, however, that isn't very important in the eyes of the UN General Assembly and Security Council, who continually pass one-sided resolutions that single out and condemn Israel. An overwhelmingly powerful bloc led by the Arab nations promotes a narrow and slanderous agenda meant to isolate Israel. This agenda has met little resistance. The UN's General Assembly votes on 70 to 100 resolutions annually. 15 to 20 of these regularly express disapproval of Israel. From 2016 until 2020, the Assembly adopted 122 resolutions criticizing various countries. 91 of these targeted Israel. That's 75% of all country-specific resolutions. And while 3/4 of this global forum's written rage lambastes the Jewish state, precious few of the most repressive or blood-soaked regimes on earth have received even a single rebuke. Emergency special sessions of the Assembly are rare. During the last 40 years, they've been convened for one purpose only: to condemn Israel. The Assembly's embrace of a terrorist entity has been equally astounding. In October 1974, 14 years before the Palestinian Liberation Organization even nominally forswore terrorism, the Assembly voted to invite a PLO spokesman to take part in its deliberations. This was the first time that anyone who was neither a government representative nor a head of a quasi-state was granted such a privilege. The following year, the Assembly awarded the PLO permanent representative status. A few months later, the UN infamously approved Resolution 3379, branding Zionism as a form of racism. At the time, Israel's UN ambassador, Chaim Herzog, told his fellow delegates that Hitler would have felt at home listening to the UN debate on the measure.
For us, the Jewish people, this is no more than a piece of paper, and we shall treat it as such.
Since the 1993 Oslo Accords, hundreds of Israelis have been killed and thousands injured by Palestinian terror attacks. During the same period, the UN passed dozens of resolutions deploring Israel, but not one against the terror attacks. Since the 2006 creation of the UN's Human Rights Council, most of the world's human rights abusers have suffered nary a mild rebuke. Israel, on the other hand, is chastised as often as all of the rest of the countries combined, and in terms more condemnatory. At the Council's every meeting, a topic billed as, quote, human rights situation in Palestine and other occupied Arab territories is raised as a separate agenda item, while the remaining totality of mankind constitutes a single other point on the agenda. From 2006 to May 2021, Israel was condemned in no less than 94 Human Rights Council resolutions. During the same period, Syria was condemned 36 times, North Korea 14 times, and China has been spared condemnation altogether. Even within the walls of the UN, the absurdity of its anti-Israel bias is fleetingly, partially acknowledged. In September 2006, UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan conceded.
Supporters of Israel feel that it is harshly judged by standards that are not applied to its enemies. And too often this is true, particularly in some UN bodies.
In August 2013, UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon reflected on Israel's treatment at the UN.
There are some bias against the Israeli people and government.
In December 2016, he told the UN Security Council,
A disproportionate volume of resolutions, reports, and conferences criticizing Israel.
One of the more telling comments came inadvertently in November 2013, when a UN interpreter failed to silence her microphone as she addressed her colleague.
I mean, I think when you have 5 statements, not 5, like a total of 10 resolutions on Israel and Palestine, there's got to be something. C'est un peu trop, no? I mean, I know it's yes, it's right, but it's not the. There's other really bad happening. Nobody says anything about the other stuff. Apologies.
Okay, I understand there was a problem with interpretation.
Israel is not larger than 8,019 square miles in total. It is the Middle East's only functioning democracy and champion of human rights. It is a world provider of humanitarian disaster relief and medical, agricultural, ecological, scientific, technological, and security innovations. But when seen through the lens of historical UN bias, the overwhelming majority of all the world's evils and all of the world's ills belong to the tiny Jewish homeland in which Isaiah spoke his vision of swords being beaten into plowshares.
All right. That's the story, huh? That's a little rundown of our good friends at the UN. All right, so let's get back to our question after this video. And I'll put it up here on the screen. How should we differentiate between legitimate criticism of Israel and criticism motivated by anti-Semitism? Which means, is this legit that we are calling so much of the anti-Israel criticism that we are seeing? Is it legit that we call that anti-Semitism? So here's a text. Let's read a text together. It's a text from our sages, from the Medrash. And it speaks about one of the most infamous tyrants, anti-Semites, who persecuted the Jews, the Roman Emperor Hadrian. Nobody was as cruel to the Jews as Hadrian. And for the run of his leadership, he enacted so many harsh decrees against the Jews. Specifically, he enacted laws to weaken Jewish observance. That was his number one priority. So here's a text. Here's a text that our sages tell us. Text 2 on page 88. Sarah, how are you, Sarah? All the way from Ann Arbor. How you doing? All right, would you like to join us? Text 2. Text 2, page 88.
The text titled Double Standard?
Yes.
Okay. Double Standard. Imicantron wrote to Emperor Hadrian, if it is circumcision that you hate, Arabian tribes also circumcise. If it is Shabbat observance that you despise, the Kuthians similarly observe Shabbat. Clearly then, you simply hate the Jewish people. Their God will exact punishment from you.
Uh-huh. All right. So Amy Cantrin, which by the way, we have no clue who this person is. It's the only record of such a name historically. All right. So this guy challenges Hadrian. He says, Hadrian, I understand you if you say that you have a problem with circumcision. Maybe you think circumcision is barbaric. And therefore, you're going to protect the world by outlawing circumcision. Okay, I get that. But then if so, if you have a problem with circumcision, also the Arab tribes, they also circumcise. Why are you not going after them? And if it's something against Shabbos, okay, listen, if this is a value of yours, you're the ruler, you get to make laws. But the Kuthians, we won't talk right now about who that people are. They lived in northern Israel. Till today, I think they're called the Samaritans. Till today, there's a Kuthian community. The Kuthians adopted a lot of Jewish practices when they came to Israel. We're talking 2,500 years ago, more than that. And they kept Shabbos, some form of Shabbos. So Amy Cantrin tells Hadrian, what about the Kuthians? You're only going after the Jews. He says, this is proof that all of your decrees have nothing to do with circumcision or Shabbos. It's all about the hate for the Jews. You simply hate the Jewish people. This is what we call, in common parlance, double standard. What's the problem with applying a double standard? Israel does something. So you say, hey, Israel, why are you doing that? So you'll say, but one second, China also does that. So a lot of people push back to the double standard argument. And they say, you're just distracting from the issue. Stop saying, oh, what about China? What about North Korea? What about Iran? We're talking about Israel right now. You know, and the answer is no. It's a very important question. This is not at all a distraction. This determines if we mean business, if we're being serious, or if this is just Jew hatred. If you really care about human rights, I respect you for that. That's fine. But if you only care about human rights when it comes to the Jews, that proves to me that it's nothing to do with human rights. You just have a problem with Jews. You understand? It tells us, is this conversation legitimate? If not, then it has nothing to do with Palestinians. It has nothing to do with human rights. It has nothing to do with settlements. It has to do with simple anti-Semitism. And we should feel very comfortable when we see double standard. That's a proof. The proof is in the pudding. This has nothing to do with social justice. This has nothing to do with human rights. This is pure, simple hatred of the Jewish people. Sometimes hard to tell. It's very simple. Very simple. Look if the people or the bodies or the organizations, when they target Israel and they have these problems with Israel, does it bother them when the same exact supposed crimes, which means we're not getting into the debate if Israel is indeed guilty of these crimes. That's a separate issue. But let's not even go there. Let's back up first. Understand? Let's see, do they care about other things as well? If they only care when it comes to the Jews, it's proof that their whole argument is flawed. They really don't care about anything. All they care about is hating Jews, and they use the supreme authority of the day, which is human rights, as an axe against the Jews. That's the way it works. You know, like I remember hearing once, I think I read it once, Alan Dershowitz says that the former president of Harvard University, this in the 1920s, says he wants to either bar or severely limit the amount of Jews allowed to come into Harvard. He said, why? Because Jews cheat. So one of the trustees of the university said, but everybody else cheats too. He says, you're distracting from the issue. Right now we're talking about the Jews. Understand? Distracting from the issue. Right now we're talking about Jews. This has nothing to do with people cheating. This has to do with the Jews. How can we get the Jews out? Okay, so we'll find a good excuse. That's the way it works. In modern times, Nathan Sharansky came up with a formula. He says, this is the formula, and this has been widely adopted as the official formula to determine if it's legitimate criticism of Israel or if it is anti-Semitism. He calls it the 3D test. And let's read it together. Text 3, page 89. Rochelle, how are you? Would you like to read, Rochelle? All right, wonderful. Page 89.
The 3D test. I believe that we can apply a simple test, I call it the 3D test, to help us distinguish legitimate criticism of Israel from anti-Semitism. The first D is the test of demonization. When the Jewish state is being demonized, when Israel's actions are blown out of all sensible proportion, when comparisons are made between Israelis and Nazis and between Palestinian refugee camps and Auschwitz, this is anti-Semitism, not legitimate criticism of Israel. The second D is the test of double standards. When criticism of Israel is applied selectively, when Israel is singled out by the United Nations for human rights abuses, while the behavior of known and major abusers, such as China, Iran, Cuba, and Syria, is ignored, when Israel's Magen David Adom, alone among the world's ambulance services, is denied admission to the International Red Cross, this is anti-Semitism. The third D is the test of delegitimization. When Israel's fundamental right to exist is denied, alone among all peoples in the world, this too is anti-Semitism.
There we go. 3 Ds. 3 Ds. Demonization, double standards, delegitimization. On page 90, you see this over here, right? We'll put it up over here as well on the screen. This is the proof that this is not real, legitimate criticism. These are the 3 signs that we are dealing with absolute anti-Semitism. No. Well, somebody there was. By the way, today this already changed. The Magen David Adom is now part of the. But something's wrong when you see that. You know, here's the thing. I want to give you one of the strongest examples today, and it's just an interesting thing to know. One of the biggest criticisms thrown at Israel is that they're violators of international law. Never heard that before? Did you ever wonder what law they're violating? So I'll tell you. 4th Geneva Convention, Article 496. All right. What does it say in Article 496 of the 4th Geneva Convention? It says that if there is an occupying power, an occupying country, the country is not allowed to move any portion of its civilians into the occupied territories. So whenever one power occupies land, they are not allowed to move their citizens into that land. So the claim is thrown at Israel that you have moved. You have. That's what I'm just looking for. Yeah, there are settlers living where? In occupied territories. In 1967, you have occupied the West Bank and you move civilians in there. You are violators of international law. Now, Israel has a very good, robust legal argument to that. But that's beyond the point. That's besides the point. Here's the real question. How many times in history, from 1946, I believe, or 1945, when the 4th Geneva Convention happened and Article 496 was ratified, how many times was Article 496 invoked against a country that is violating this law? How many times? Against how many countries? Only one country. Only Israel. So you could think, well, maybe Israel is the only violator of Article 496 of the 4th Geneva Convention. The answer is no. Take a look in your books on page 108. All right, just take a look over here. On page 108, at the end of today's lesson, we have a little infographic, a little page over here, which shows us not even all, but just a few of the major violators of Article 496, actual violators. These people do not have any legal argument against the violation. We're talking about lots, very significant violations over here. Never was Article 496 invoked and used against these nations, even though they are blatant, gross violators of Article 496. So that just comes and tells you that the next time somebody comes around and says Israel violates international law, before we even go into the arguments, is Israel violating it? Is Israel not violating it? The question is, 1 second. Are you concerned about international law, or you only care about Israel? And if it's only care about Israel, I'm sorry, but that is anti-Semitism. that is, in a nutshell, what we're dealing with today. We have to be very confident. I just want to say this right now. We have to be very confident that when we find somebody criticizing Israel, and they say, look, we're legit, we really care about human rights, and how could you say that we don't care about human rights? And the 3D test. And specifically, I think the strongest proof is number 2, which is what our sages tell us, the double standard. Double standard. If you see double standard, we do not mean business. This is simple hatred of Jewish people. This is pure bias against Jewish people, and we have to be very confident in that. But in today's class, I want to focus on a very specific, unique part of the issue today. And this is what I want for the next 50 minutes. I want to focus on this part, which is very painful. It's a very sore topic. Anti-Semitism is always painful, but what makes it particularly difficult and painful and hurtful is when fellow Jews join ranks with anti-Semites and unwittingly give them support and legitimation for their anti-Semitic causes. And that is what we're seeing today with Israel, that especially with our Jewish youth, more and more Jews are identifying with people who hate Jews, hate Israel, and Jews are getting attracted to that. Now, I want to be very, very careful over here. I want to set the tone for today's class. Today's class is not at all going to be about calling other Jews anti-Semites. Some people feel good, like self-righteous, by being able to tear down other people and speak negatively about other people, but that's not what we're going to be doing over here. I want to be grounded over here. I want to be level-headed. I want to talk about a real issue with you over here, and what we could do about it, but without actually going to putting down fellow Jews. And frankly, and we'll talk about this more in a moment, I put no blame on young Jews who join anti-Israel movements. The onus is not on them. The onus is on us, educators, their parents, their grandparents, the community. That's really who's at fault over here. Young Jews are simply doing what they think is right. So the question is, before the question, the real issue when Jews join the ranks of anti-Semitism, number one, it's painful, it's very painful. But number two, it gives a very powerful legitimacy to these anti-Israel forces. You try calling them anti-Semitism, they say, we're anti-Semitism. We love Jews. We have Jews on our boards. We have Jews as part of our leadership team. We're not the anti-Semites. We love Jews. So that is going to be what I want to speak about. When Jews join forces with the haters, it gives them legitimacy, it gives them strength. And I want to ask you 2 questions. There's 2 questions I want to discuss with you. Number one, why is this happening? Let's try to diagnose the issue. What's the diagnosis? What gets Jews to go and join an anti-Semitic cause? And number 2, how could we make it stop? I think that's the most important question. How can we outsmart the anti-Semitism, right? Anti-Semitisms figured out a way how to get Jews to support them. Unbelievable. How do we get that to stop? Now, I want to be very, very clear over here. I am not of the opinion that anything about Israel is off the table for discussion. I am actually somebody who feels that every single issue in Israel could be discussed, should be discussed, could be debated. And they're legitimate questions. I find no problem having a discussion with somebody and debating the issue of 2-state solution, debating the issue of the settlements, debating Israel's security tactics, defense tactics. All of these are valid arguments. So I don't mean that there should be this blanket support of Israel, and anybody who doesn't have that, we brand them as a Jew who supports anti-Semitism. I think that's a very unfair thing to say. What I do say is that when there's a sentiment amongst Jewish youth, a general disinterest, a general lack of association, a general lack of support of Israel, that's a problem. I think that's what we're dealing with over here. It's when there's real anti-Semites. It's not criticism against Israel. There's anti-Semites and Jews are joining those anti-Semites. I think that's the issue. So let's begin with question number one. Why is this happening? Let's diagnose the issue. Have there ever been periods of history before today where Jews have joined the ranks, helped support our enemies, joined the ranks of anti-Semites? And the answer is yes. So when does it happen? It's a very interesting thing. Let's talk a little bit about history. If you look throughout all of history at all the different anti-Semitic, all the different anti-Semitic events that have happened in history, you will be able to put them all into two different categories. And we'll call them by two famous holidays. There's something called Purim anti-Semitism, Purim with the story of Haman. And there's something called Hanukkah anti-Semitism, which is coming up, right? In a week and a half is Hanukkah. There's Purim anti-Semitism. There's Hanukkah anti-Semitism. What's the difference? Purim anti-Semitism says, I want all Jews dead. Very simple to understand. Haman, that was Haman's agenda. Nazis, that's Purim anti-Semitism. A lot of terrorist groups today. That's what they say. We want Jews dead. That's one form of anti-Semitism. Purim anti-Semitism. Purim anti-Semitism says, I want to destroy the Jewish people. Then there's something called Hanukkah anti-Semitism. Hanukkah anti-Semitism is a little bit more nuanced. It takes on a little bit of a different form. So the story of Hanukkah happened in the 2nd century before the Common Era, 2,200 years ago, give or take a few years, or somewhere around that ballpark. And the villain in the story was a guy, his name was Antiochus Epiphanes, who was the leader of the Syrian Greeks, the Seleucid Syrian Greeks. And Antiochus, he didn't say, I want all Jews gone. Antiochus says, I actually have no problem with Jews. I like Jews. I like Jews. I just don't like a few stuff about Jews. Jews need to change a few things. They got to get away a few negative stuff, and then we could, and then we could be, and then we're good. That's Antiochus. Right? There's the right way, and the Jews have a few things that are just simply in the way of them joining the right way of living, the right way of thinking, and therefore we got to change it. So what's an example of this? An example is that in Greek society, they worshiped the body. They worshipped the image of the body. That was very cultural to beautify the body. They would play sports in the nude. It was all about, taking in, beholding the beauty of the human body. They looked at the act of circumcision as outright barbaric. You're going to destroy your body. You're taking away from the natural look of your body. Especially them, that was a part of the body that they showed off. It was, again, right? They played sports, so it was very normal in the nude, without any clothing. So they said, we have to stop circumcision. So they made a law, no more circumcisions, because it goes against the right way. It goes against the progressive way of thinking, the progressive ideology. Okay, but here's the thing. So that's basically the example. We've had this all throughout history. Hanukkah anti-Semitism. We've always had those people who says, I like Jews. I don't mind Jews. You just got to change a few stuff. The communists were exactly the same way. The communists embraced Jews who embraced communism. You could still be Jews. You just got to give up a few stuff, a few beliefs. What was that?
Like your religion.
Like your religion, right? But not even your entire religion. You could still have some cultural stuff, but don't be too religious. Don't be too religious. You got to buy into our beliefs. You've always had these ideas of people who weren't against the entity of Jewish people per se, but it was about beliefs or religions. How many beliefs, how little beliefs, that was already. But here's the idea. Purim anti-Semitism. Could Jews join Purim anti-Semitism? Did that ever happen? The answer is no. I don't think you'll really ever find Jews joining Purim anti-Semitism because the agenda is kill Jews. It's very difficult to get a Jew behind that type of agenda, right? So historically, Jews never really got behind Purim anti-Semitism. But Hanukkah anti-Semitism, Hanukkah anti-Semitism, historically, any time there was Hanukkah anti-Semitism, Jews were attracted to join. Jews have joined the cause. Now, why is this? It's a very, very simple thing. Number one, Hanukkah anti-Semitism never asks a Jew to reject their Judaism, so to speak, right? You could still be a Jew. You could even consider yourself a proud Jew, or consider yourself the modern Jew, the Jew who is embracing the way of the new world. You're not a primitive, you're not regressive. So it feels very cutting edge. It feels very good to be part of the Hanukkah anti-Semitism, because we are part of changing the world. We're bringing the world into the new dawn, a new age. And they say, you know why we're joining ranks with these people who are targeting the Jews? They're right. Judaism and Jews are great people, and we have a few negative elements. We have to save Jews from the problems. We have to save Jews from the Jews. We're going to save the Jewish people by getting rid of these negative elements. And that is a story. That's what happened by Hanukkah. By Hanukkah, unfortunately, it's a very painful episode of Jewish history. Many Jews joined, became Hellenists, have turned their backs on their fellow Jewish brothers, and joined forces with the enemies to persecute the Jews. But they said, I love Jews. You think I'm anti-Jews? I have the Jewish people's best interest. But what's best for the Jewish people is to change with these few things. And this is classic Hanukkah anti-Semitism, where the anti-Semite comes and says, I love Jews. I love Jews. You just got to change a few stuff. And if not, I'm going to persecute you. And Jews, unfortunately, were seduced historically to join. That's the story. And as I mentioned, this happened in the former Soviet Union. There was a Jewish communist party called the Yevsektia. These were Jews, young Jews, and they were proud Jews. They spoke Yiddish. They considered themselves very culturally Jewish, but they literally, with unbelievable hatred, persecuted fellow Jews who didn't join the communist movement. And what do they say? We're saving Jews from Jews. We're saving the future of Judaism by embracing the new way of life. So I want to put this up over here. I think this is very important. I want to summarize with you. What are the reasons why it's easy for Jews to join Hanukkah anti-Semitism? It's easy for Jews to join Hanukkah anti-Semitism. Number one, we're not asking a Jew to renounce Judaism. Again, they say I'm a Jew. They even say I'm a proud Jew. I love Judaism. So that's number one. It's an easy sell. Number two, they claim we are saving Judaism. Right? We're saving Judaism from negative elements, from the people who won't let go of primitive ways, the people who are holding us back. And number three, they are joining a new sophisticated worldview. It sounds very exciting. They feel very good about themselves. We're part of the up and coming new ideology. And this is the reality. Let's read text 4. Let us read text 4. All right. Let's see, where are we holding over here? Alan or Nita, would one of you like to read? Text 4, page 91. And I have to tell you, this is, I don't know, this is a very critical text. And it's a little bit uncomfortable for me, but okay. Text 4, page 91, we'll read it.
Two forms of anti-Semitism. Hanukkah anti-Semitism doesn't demand dead or expelled Jews, at least not at first. Instead, it demands the destruction of Jewish civilization. This process requires not dead Jews, but Jews who are willing to give up whatever specific aspect of Jewish civilization is deemed to be uncool. Of course, Judaism has always been uncool, which is why cool people find it so threatening, and why Jews who are willing to become cool are absolutely necessary to Hanukkah-style anti-Semitism's success. In the days of Antiochus, this type of anti-Semitism needed those boys who voluntarily underwent painful genital surgery to prove that Jews weren't the problem, just the barbarity of Jewish law. Hanukkah-style anti-Semitism always promises Jews a kind of nobility, offering them the opportunity to cleanse themselves of whatever the people around them happen to find revolting. The Jewish traits designated as repulsive vary by country and time period, but they invariably contradict the specific values that the surrounding culture has embraced as universal. Thanks to Judaism's inherent uncoolness, there will never be a shortage of Jews willing to comply.
All right. It's a painful reality. Saying if we want to diagnose the problem, this is the historical way it worked. Hanukkah, anti-Semitism, Judaism is uncool. Whenever there's a new progressive message, young Jews identify with what's cutting edge, with what's exciting, with what's progressive. And when what is progressive is used against Jews, then Jews join those ranks. That's the unfortunate story over here. And bring this to today. If you look at the top of the screen, this is why it's easy for Jews to join. Let's put it up over here. All right. This is why it's easy for Jews to join Israel anti-Semitism. You see this up over here? Same three reasons. What is going on today? I'm saying let's diagnose the issue right now. And again, my point of view is not to condemn anything. This is we're just diagnosing what's happening. What is in vogue today? What's the modern way of thinking today? What's progressive? Progressive is human rights, social justice. And within that environment where the supreme authority, where the supreme progressive authority is human rights and social justice, that is used against Jews. Which means, at least for the purpose of today's class, I don't want you to get me wrong, it's not like I have an issue with progressivism, with liberalism, with social justice. That's not our topic tonight, right? The same, I don't have a problem if there's a society that's obsessed with carrots, understand? The point is, what's most important today? What's the authority? Social justice. That is used against Israel. What happens? Jews want to be cool. Young Jews want to be cool. Young Jews want to identify with what's progressive. And if what's progressive doesn't fit with some element of Judaism, then we have to repudiate that part of Judaism. We have to get rid of, we have to cleanse Judaism of that part of Judaism. So the modern form of anti-Semitism, one of the forms of modern anti-Semitism, which is anti-Israel bias, Jews could join because you don't have to renounce Judaism. They could say, I'm a Jew. I care very deeply about Jews and Judaism. But I want to save Judaism from such negative elements. And it's attractive because it's a sophisticated worldview. That's exactly what's happening over here. So this is the diagnosis of why there are young Jews who are joining anti-Israel movements simply because it's cutting edge. This is the modern worldview. This is what's progressive. And progressivism dictates that Israel is the expression of everything we hate. Everything progressivism hates, that's Israel. So of course, we have to be anti-Israel. We have to dismantle Israel. We have to undermine Israel. It's a very simple thing that's happening. So that's the diagnosis. And I think that's an accurate diagnosis. I really think, and I think this is just a realistic look at what's happening. The question is, what can we do about this? What can we do? Well, you tell me, what's the classical Jewish response? We've been dealing with this problem for decades, really. It started already in the 70s. You tell me, what has been the Jewish establishment's answer to this problem? How do we get Jews to identify more with Israel and stop joining ranks with anti-Semites?
Go to Israel.
Bring them to Israel, right? Bring them to Israel. That's one answer. Yeah, what else?
Logical facts and education.
Education. So there's bring them to Israel, and then there's education. Let's keep both those on the table, because those are probably the two main efforts. When we're talking millions and millions of dollars annually, millions and millions, hundreds of millions probably, are invested into Israel education and bringing young Jews to Israel and trying to get Jews to identify more with Israel. Let's take a critical look at this, all right? So taking people to Israel, we all know what that looks like, right? Taking them to Israel, you show them the land, you try to build up a sense of connection, and then hopefully they will maintain that connection through their adolescent and adult life. That's basically right. Education, let's talk about education. What are some of the common arguments given to why we should claim ownership over the land of Israel? You can take a moment. I want you to think about this. Let's take a few moments. It's in your books on page 93. In your books on page 93, if you have a pen, you could do it with a pen. I want you to think, what are the top 3 reasons given for the basis of the Jewish right to Israel. And let's list them in the order of priority, the order of importance, or the order of frequency that they are cited within the Jewish community, generally speaking. And go ahead and unmute yourself, and let's get some ideas. What's education? Go ahead, Sheldon.
In terms of the Jewish right to Israel, one of the most common ones is the Holocaust.
The Holocaust. What about the Holocaust?
A place of refuge for those who are victims of the Holocaust.
Oh.
And Israel has a right to exist because of the Holocaust.
Which means like this: the Holocaust has proven that we Jews cannot rely on anybody else to take care of our survival and our security on the most simple terms, and therefore we need our own country to secure Jewish survival. We need our own country with our own government, with our own army, to be able to stand behind the Jewish people in their time of need in order to secure Jewish survival. That's one reason. Yeah, very good. That is definitely a reason given. Gail, go ahead.
It's God-given. God gave us that land.
It's God-given, that's right. Now, I want to ask you an honest question, Gail. I'm just wondering, is that a commonly offered answer? Meaning, yeah, of course, you're talking to a rabbi over here. I'm totally with you. That's a good answer. One second. Is this a commonly given answer in seminars and educational experiences for Jewish youth, teenagers, college?
No, but it should be. No.
Okay, I'm just wondering, is this a common answer? That's the merits or demerits of these answers we'll get to in a moment. God gave it to the Jewish people. Is that common? Is that a commonly given answer?
No.
No. You say, what was that?
That's historical.
Then there's historical. Oh, very good. So Lance just said, and I'll repeat it for all of you here on Zoom. There's the historical argument. We've always been there. We have a 3,000 plus year history in Israel. We've had, we've everything, we've culturally, we've built up in Israel. Yeah, there's the historical argument. So far we have
geological.
What was that?
Geologically, they're digging up all kinds of historical and geological artifacts that show that we were there 3,000 years ago.
That's right. The history is backed up by a tremendous amount of archaeological findings. In fact, just this past week, they've announced they found about Hanukkah. They found a Greek fortress, and the Jews attacked it. The Maccabees attacked it. They literally found it in which part of Israel? Anyways, it was very interesting. They found a whole bunch of, and they were able to. But that's David. That's to the historical argument.
It wasn't that in Timnah?
What was that?
Wasn't that in Timnah? They found that in a dig.
I don't think so. I just saw pictures, but I didn't take too long to look at it. Maybe in the post, in the email I sent it after the class, I'll try to find a link. Okay. What? Any other arguments? We have 3 arguments so far. We have survival, Jewish survival. We have God gave it to the Jewish people. We have
legitimacy.
We have
through
the historical.
Balfour.
What was that? What was that?
Legitimacy through the Balfour Declaration.
Oh, it's legal. The legal argument. It's legal. International law. I want to focus on these 3, the commonly given arguments. These are the common arguments given within Jewish establishment. If you would go and join a seminar in some college campus where they bring a speaker to educate the kids about Israel, they're probably going to be speaking about these 3 arguments, and these are the 3 arguments presented in Israel's Declaration of Independence. If you open up the Israel's Declaration of Independence, these are the 3 given reasons why Israel should survive. Number 1, international law. That's a picture of Mr. Balfour, everybody. By the way. So, in the year 1917, there's the Balfour Declaration, where they announced that His Majesty's government finds it. We stand behind, we viewed with favor the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine, a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. And a few years later, 1922, the League of Nations, which was the predecessor of the United Nations, makes this into the British Mandate for Palestine. 1947, you have the Partition Plan. 1948, the UN votes that Israel should be established as a state. And the rest is history. But what's the point of it? The argument is this is legal. It's law. International law gives us a right to the land of Israel. That's argument number 1. Argument number 2, Jewish survival. The Holocaust has taught us, has highlighted to us in a very painfully stark way that the Jewish people can rely on nobody, on literally nobody, to have our back at our time of need. When 6 million Jews were slowly being butchered, the world stood by silently.
Yeah.
And even when the Allies started fighting against the Nazis, they refused to bomb the train tracks to the camps. And this highlighted the need that the Jews need to self-govern, need to have their own government, need to have our own country, our own government, our own army who can stand behind and we can defend ourselves and secure the survival of the Jewish people. This is the argument of Jewish survival. The argument is we've learned the lesson bitterly. We need our own country to survive and to stand behind us. Argument number 3 is the history. We Jews have a 3,000 plus year historical connection to the land. So much of Jewish history has been in the land of Israel. There is no self-respecting historian which would claim otherwise. And every single day, there's even more and more archaeological evidence found to support all this, to corroborate all of this. And not only that, there have always been Jews living in the Holy Land. Do you know this? Even though the Jews have been expelled from Israel, you will never find a single error in history over the past 3,000 years. From when the Jews entered Israel, crossed the Jordan with Joshua, and entered the Holy Land, never once was Israel vacant of Jews. There were always at least a few thousand Jews living. It's a historical fact. So we have a long history in Israel. It's very significant to us historically. And in a certain way, we've never left. This is the historical argument, history. So we have 3 things: international law, Jewish survival, we have history. This is common established wisdom. Why does Israel have a right to exist? And what should we be educating the Jews of why we should stand behind Israel? These 3 arguments. Let's think this through now. All right? Let's think this through. Let's be real. So many young Jews are not pro-Israel. I think it's a fact. It's probably a very uncomfortable number. You know, I can only imagine what percentage of young Jews don't have Israel's back and join the ranks on some level, identify on some level with anti-Semitic forces, anti-Semitic movements. My question for you is are these arguments going to do the trick? Have they done the trick? Saying we've been doing this for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Educating, trying to raise our children to love Israel, to identify with Israel. And these were the arguments given. Is the issue simply that the Jews who are anti-Israel just don't know of these 3 arguments? Yeah, sure.
A hell of a lot of young Jews or even older Jews don't know the history. They think that Israel's always been occupied principally by non-Jews, that Jews were interlopers, and that when thinks that there weren't Jews there for a while, that was of their own decision. It wasn't expulsion. And I think if they knew that, they wanted to embrace that, they would probably at least be less virulent anti-Israel, because that would undermine the arguments they would make against Israel and for some of the other cultures.
Yeah. So, yeah. So what you're saying, what Stuart is saying is, I want to repeat it, is that, many don't know. And if they would be educated, they would have a larger respect for the existence of Israel. I think that's true to a degree. More education always helps. But I do think there's a reality we have to face. It's a reality. It's a fact. Let's even think in terms of our local community, Metro Detroit. Metro Detroit kid. Let's say they even went to Hillel as a kid. Or let's say they were even in a public school. But still, this is a very strong community culturally. You go to your synagogue, go to your temple. There's events around Israel. There's a very pro-Israel. We support Israel. The Federation supports Israel. Chances are most kids were raised in a pro-Israel home, pro-Israel environment. And yet the reality is they're leaving. At a certain point in life, they are leaving. That was me. So why is that? Meaning, let's be real over here. Why are these arguments not working? Dr. Lieb, yes. You got to unmute, doctor, or else we can't hear you.
I don't know, from what I see, the education of Jewish children is not the greatest. It's even different than when I was a child. And I'm not saying that I always fought against it, but my education was 10 times better than my children and my grandchildren. That's the first thing. Right. Second, they are being influenced. They want to be part of the group, and they're being influenced by teachers and professors that are anti-Semitic. Mm-hmm. And in order to be part of that group, they have to take on some of the ideas of these people. And I think they're being brainwashed, actually.
So let's unpack that, doctor. Let's unpack that. I want to read a text with you. Okay, this is a text. And I want to analyze this text with you. It's text 5 on page 94. Text 5 is written by a Jew. Her name is Phyllis Bennis. Could be you've heard of her. She is an anti-Israel activist. And she's not a young Jew. I think she's in her 70s. This is a Jew who was raised, not in the 1990s, not in the 2000s. She was raised in the 40s and the 50s. The days when there was real strong Jewish support for Israel. Let's see what she writes, and I want to analyze this with you. Let's read text 5 on page 94. And Julie or Doug, let's get back to you. Let's try this out. I think it'll work now. There you go.
Okay. We had a problem. We can't see you.
We can't see you at all.
But we can hear you.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
That's okay. That's all right. We're making it work. Okay. When I was a Jewish kid, right?
Yeah.
When I was a Jewish kid growing up in suburban Los Angeles, we thought being Jewish meant supporting Israel. There really wasn't a choice. If you identified as Jewish, as I and most of my friends did, the religious education we got, the youth groups we joined, and the summer camps where we played were all grounded in one thing. It wasn't God, it was Zionism, the political project of settling Jewish people in Israel. My own break with Zionism came in my mid-20s, after reading the letters of Zionism's founder, Theodore Herzl, imploring Cecil Rhodes, the leader of British land theft in Africa, to support his work in Palestine. Their projects were both something colonial, Herzl assured Rhodes.
All right, so what's happening over here? I think this is really a model of what's happening with our youth. You grow up pro-Israel. Sure, Israel. Yeah. What happens one day? You become a teenager. You hear about social values, social justice. You hear about human rights. What are all the evils of the world? Colonialism, imperialism, racism, and all of a sudden you discover whether it's correct or wrong. That's not the point. All of a sudden it comes to a point that Israel, oh, 1 second. Israel is the #1 violator of all the biggest evils of the world. So I can stand behind Israel. That's basically, I think, what happens. And the problem is that all these 3 arguments that you make simply don't hold any water. Once a kid feels that Israel is a violator of all of their deeply cherished values. Let's just go through it. All right, let's think about some counter arguments. International law. What's the counter? Why don't Jewish youth who are anti-Israel, why don't they buy into the international law argument? What do you say? Very simple. Okay, yeah, law from a strictly legal perspective, yes, law. and Mr. 1917 British Empire, that was the paragon of morality. International law is immoral. So, okay, so it's international law. But the whole thing is one big immoral institution. And not only that, they say that we are on a campaign to change international law. We want to have the whole world stop recognizing Israel. So they say, I know it's international law. And guess what? International law is racist. That's what they say. Very simple counter argument. There goes that. Which means, yeah, from a legal perspective, it's law. From a morality perspective, I couldn't care less. It's immoral. Jewish survival. What's the response? What do they say to Jewish survival? They say, yeah, I'm all for Jewish survival. I support Jewish survival, but not at the expense of the Palestinians' rights. You want to survive? Everybody gives you the right to survive, not on that guy's dime. That's the argument. You want to survive? Go find somewhere else to survive. Don't mow down, don't bulldoze down somebody else's rights just because you need to survive. The argument is given, you could be anywhere else. You don't have to be in Israel. Dismantle Israel. If you want to ensure, if you want to secure Jewish survival for the next 100 years, move somewhere else. Go find some other place on planet Earth where you're not going to be stepping on anybody else's toes, you're not going to be kicking anybody else out of their houses, and gesund to hate. Enjoy your Jewish survival. Got to do it here. I mean, again, I'm not saying that these are good arguments. I'm not saying they're legitimate arguments. I'm saying what the arguments are. We need to understand why these arguments are simply not working. Another argument given, by the way, is you think it's good for Jewish survival by concentrating 7 million Jews in a tiny plot of land in the worst neighborhood in the world? Right? I think it's better for Jewish survival where we're all over the place. A lot harder for those who want to kill us to get us. You put 7 million people in one place, and God forbid we should never even speak about these things. And one atomic bomb can take them all out at once, God forbid. In 1967, we realized just how scary it is to have so many Jews in one concentrated place. A genocide is much easier to accomplish. Sarah, you have a question? Go ahead.
Well, I've also heard, I think that they minimize the threat to Jews. So another counter argument to Jewish survival is like, we're fine.
Exactly.
What's going to happen? It's 2021. The boogeyman's going to get us. Like, they don't sort of recognize that the answer is, well, sort of, yes. You know, there's a lot of anti-Semitism alive and well, but there's a minimization of like, it couldn't happen here. It couldn't happen again, in my opinion, as well.
Yeah, you're 100% right, Sarah. That's another argument. Let all the Jews move to Texas. No one's killing you in Texas. Yeah, sure, come to America. Again, which is the same idea. You want to survive? I'm all for Jewish survival. But don't violate somebody else's rights. I don't agree with that. So that's the argument against Jewish survival. You know, why does it have to be Israel specifically? You know, is this even a good strategy? And the historical argument, I think, is the weakest argument. You've been there for all of your history, good for you. Doesn't give you the right to come back. Right? Could the Greeks walk into Egypt one day and say, oh, we have the longest connection to Egypt? The Greeks are the oldest people alive who once ruled over Egypt. The Arabs only came to Egypt much, much later. So the Greeks could maybe walk into Egypt today, tell all the Arabs to go pack your bags because this is our land. We have the deepest historical connection. They could probably find a lot of archaeological finds that will corroborate their deep historical connection. Can the Dutch come back and demand New York back? You know? Yeah, Native Americans kick us all out. You know what I'm saying? We all understand that's not the way the world works. So this is the weakest part, which means, yeah, it's beautiful. Jews have a deep historical connection to Israel. At the end of the day, when you're dealing with somebody who sees Israel as the #1 violator of the most important values, most deeply cherished values of the day, these arguments are not going to do the trick, period. As we do see. And we can't delude ourselves. Let's repeat them a few more times. Maybe they'll start believing it. We have to realize what's happening over here. These arguments simply do not hold water. They don't have any strength. They're not stable enough in the face of this ideology of the authority today is human rights, social justice, and Israel is the #1, is the top expression. Now, I'm not saying that any of these counter arguments are valid. Maybe some are, maybe some aren't. But what we are saying is that Jews are taking these positions. The positions that used to be up here on the screen. Jews are taking these positions. So we need to go further. We need to find a deeper answer. Okay, Max, try now. Max, you want to try speaking? Unmute, I apologize.
Okay, so what I was trying to say was that not everybody is subject to persuasion. If you read the Bennis piece, the argument that she makes is so ridiculous, so foolish, that it's beyond belief. So Herzl wrote a letter to a powerful man of his age, phrasing the argument for Israel in Cecil Rhodes' terms, and now Israel shouldn't exist. that was what it took to turn her off of Israel?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. But
You know,
or even
or even if Herzl was no good, that means Israel shouldn't exist.
Right.
You know,
Right.
that changed everything.
Right. But meaning, but you see the general approach, the general thinking. We have values. These are the authoritative values of our time. These are right. These are sacrosanct values, and Israel seems to be in violation of that. Okay, here's the idea. And by the way, to your point, Max, it's for a separate discussion. I'm for sure not taking the position that Theodor Herzl truly believed that Israel was a colonial project. It could be debated. Did he think so? Did he not think so? Did he only write that in order to curry favor from an influential individual who was pro-colonialism? The point is that all you need is something to tick you off. 100 years ago, saying the word colonialism wasn't a trigger to say, I hate you. Today it is. 100 years ago, it wasn't treif. Today it is. That's the basic idea. You know, there's one trick. There's one trick that we are not trying. There's one answer that we're not giving our children. We're not giving our youth. And maybe we should try it. Maybe we should try it. Gail said this earlier. There's also a biblical answer. We give three answers so far. Legal argument, Jewish survival argument, historical argument. There's one more. There's a biblical argument. What's the biblical argument? Which means, let's not talk about what society says, right? From a secular perspective, what is our right to Israel? Let's look let's give a religious answer. Now, I know you'll say, oh, you're a rabbi, of course you'll talk about religion. But 1 second, let's actually work through this issue, and let's see if this is a better strategy. What is the Jewish response? What is the Jewish claim? The authentic Jewish claim to Israel? If you open up the Torah, you don't have to go too far. It's in Genesis 1:1, literally the first verse. What's the first verse of the Torah? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. On that verse, Rashi, which is the preeminent authority of biblical interpretation and biblical commentary, Rashi, the great medieval scholar, asks a question. It's his opening question in his commentary. We're talking about the #1 most classic commentary in all of Jewish literature. Rashi asks the question, why is the Torah beginning with the story of the creation of the world? It's great information. But at the end of the day, the Torah is a book of law. Start with law. Get to the history in the later chapters. Genesis 1:1, history. Let's go. Law. Begin with the law. What does Rashi answer? Let's read text 6. Rashi's response. Why does Torah begin that way? And Max, did you read already, Max? You did already read, right? Did you? Max, Amy, you did. Okay, so let's go. Let's give the honor. What was that?
Amy hasn't.
Oh, Amy, go for it. Amy, you're right. Amy, go for it. Text 6.
Responsive opening down there, Rabbi Yitzhak.
Yes.
Rabbi Yitzhak stated, the Torah should have begun with the first mitzvah commanded to the Jewish people, which is contained in the verse, this month shall be to you, etc. Exodus chapter 12, verse 2. For what purpose does it start with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth? The solution is found in the verse, he recounted the strength of his works to his people to give them the inheritance of nations, from Psalms. In other words, if the nations of the world accuse the Jews with the claim, you are thieves for having conquered the lands of the 7 nations, the Jews should reply, the entire world is God's. He created it and granted it to whomever he desired. It was his will to initially give it to the 7 nations, and it was his will to subsequently remove it from them and give it to us.
All right, thank you, Amy. Rashi lived 1,000 years ago. He's quoting a teaching from the sages, from the Medrash, from a few hundred years earlier. Some things just don't change. And the nations of the world accuse the Jews. You are thieves You have conquered the lands of the 7 nations. What are you doing in the Holy Land? And the number one, the Torah's order was changed around. The Torah should have started with law, but the Torah starts with history for one reason and one reason only: to give the Jews the confidence, the morale to stand behind Israel and say, God gave this to us. Yeah, you're right. It's God's world. God gave the 7 nations the land of Israel initially, and then gave it to us. And where did God give it to us? Let's read text 7. Text 7 is where God promises the land of Israel to Abraham. It's going to be a covenant for his children. Let's read text 7, page 97. And Sheldon and Elisa, where by you? Text 7, page 97.
Text 7. God told Abram, raise your eyes and look around from where you are to the north and south, to the east and west. All the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever.
God told Abraham, I'm going to give your, not now, later on in history, your children are going to get the land of Israel as an eternal covenant. Eternal covenant. And according to Judaism, this is the basis, this is the fundamental right for our right to the land of Israel. Everything else is commentary. There are good reasons. There are additional good reasons. But the foundation is that God gave it to us. God gave it to us, and therefore, historically, Jews never gave up on Israel. The Jews always had a connection to Israel. I'll even just say something if you think about it. So today we take Jews to Israel, birthright. I think it's a very good thing, birthright. But I have a question for you. Do all Jewish youth that go to birthright do they all become pro-Israel? No. Historically, talking about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of Jewish history, Jews did not have birthright. Were their children pro-Israel? Yes? What's going on? The problem is not with birthright. There's one key problem. The key problem is Jewish education. I want to tell you what I mean by Jewish education. There's a very interesting letter I once saw from the Rebbe, from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Somebody wrote a letter to the Rebbe, to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and says that he witnessed something in a synagogue, and it's bothering him. He's writing about it to the Rebbe. He's like very annoyed by it. There was a synagogue that only had 9 people. Don't worry about it. That had 9 people there in the synagogue, and they needed a 10th for a minyan, a 10th man. So they called up a guy. Can you come and help us with the minyan? The guy shows up to the minyan to be the number 10th, to fill the quorum, and he shows up with a newspaper, Wall Street Journal. I don't know if that's what it was. He's sitting there in a synagogue, and the nerve. He's sitting there in a synagogue. He's reading a newspaper. Everybody's praying, and so this guy was bad mouthing this Jew to the Rebbe. Such a chutzpah. Look at the Jews today. No respect. And the Rebbe said, I see this very, very differently than you. You put all the blame on him. You know what I see in him? I understand him. When he was raised, he wasn't given a proper Jewish education. When he walks into a synagogue, it bores him. Old archaic prayers, Hebrew, please, this just doesn't talk to me. Boring. So I understand. The Rebbe says, when you see that the onus is on us, here's a Jew who needs to get educated. Here's a Jew who could use education. And in the words of the Rebbe, had he received a proper Jewish education, his flame could have been nurtured. And it's not too late. I think we have to be honest with ourselves. It's the same thing about anti-Israel. Look back at the text from Phyllis Bennis. This is the way I see the way she was taught about Israel. She was taught about Israel with 2 fundamental problems. When you're educated about Israel in this way, it is bound to fall apart. Your support in Israel. How is she educated about Israel? 2 things. I find 2 issues with her education. She says she was raised in a very staunchly Jewish Zionist home. Here are the 2 problems. Number 1, I think you see in her article here. Her worldview, the way she was raised of what Judaism is Judaism is about tikkun olam. Judaism is about social justice. Judaism is about being against colonialism and imperialism and racism. And number two, she learned about Israel, that what's Israel? What's the Jewish claim to Israel? The whole Israel is in the context of, through the lens of Theodor Herzl's political Zionist project to settle Jews into the land of Israel. That's how she saw it. It's two big mistakes, two very big problems. Two very big problems. We cannot be educating ourselves and our children that Israel and our connection with Israel began in 1948. It's a big mistake. And our connection to Israel, which is even to Max's point, is not about Theodor Herzl. Let's not make it about that. It's not even about Zionism. What we need, what Israel education has to mean for Jews, for youth, is the Jewish response, is the Jewish claim to the land of Israel. God gave it to us. When God gives you a gift, you hold on to it, you cherish it, the way you should treat any gift that God gives you. I want to put this up over here. Jewish education cannot be seen through the lens of a modern secular state of Israel that is only, 70 years old. Can't be that. They need to see Judaism from a Jewish perspective through the Jewish lens. They need to be proud of Israel. They need to know that we have an unshakable relationship to Israel. But here's the key. That education cannot happen in a vacuum. You tell a Jewish kid, God promises the land of Israel. It's going to fall flat if this Jewish youth doesn't feel a connection with God, doesn't feel a connection with Torah, doesn't have a connection with this. So what we really need, the only way for Israel education to work is through what? Educate children, not just about Israel. It's not Israel education, it's Jewish education. And not just the cheap Jewish education. A Jewish education where Jews see that Judaism is not just about social justice. Judaism and Torah is exciting, is relevant, is meaningful, is real. Let them really get their values from Judaism. And then their value system will include Israel, because that's part of our value system. That's what's needed. Jewish education cannot happen in a vacuum. The true answer for Israel, for Jewish youth to stand behind Israel, is to feel an inner confidence that God gave it to us, to the Jewish people. And even before 1948, it was our land. 500 years ago, it was always our land. We always loved Israel. Even if we hate all the policies of the government there. Nobody said you have to like policies, but you have to know this is my land. It's an inner confidence and inner morale. Only with this approach are we giving our children, our youth, a solid structure to stand on, to support Israel. If it's about history, if it's about international law, we're already losing them. Let's read text 8 as we close today's class. And then I want to discuss. I want to take some questions because I know that this is heavy stuff over here. Text 8 is a very powerful text. It's a letter written by the Rebbe to the third president of Israel. His name was Mr. Zalman Shazar. And Mr. Zalman Shazar and the Rebbe had an unbelievably deep relationship. They loved each other. They wrote a lot. They met a lot. Zalman Shazar came to visit the Rebbe in New York multiple times. And this is one letter that the Rebbe writes to Zalman Shazar specifically about this issue. This is in 1970. 1970, they've already started seeing the turning of the tide of the Jewish youth not being in support of Israel, not identifying with the land of Israel. This is what the Rebbe says. Lori, would you like to, not Lori, I apologize. No, Elisa, do you want to read? Text 8, page 98.
I have received complaints. Why do I invoke the biblical land of Israel, the Holy Land, and the covenant with Abraham in connection with modern Israel? Why do I mix God into the picture? After all, they say those who fought for the creation of the state, those who led it, those who currently direct it, and its authorized representatives, they all claim and take pains to emphasize that Israel is a state founded in 1948. My answer, put frankly, is that their narrative is false. No new entity was created in 1948. Rather, that was the year in which a large part of the land of Israel was liberated. An entity established in 1948 based on the agreement or authorization of the nations of the world have no strength or justification in terms of an authentic response to the claim. You are thieves for having conquered lands belonging to others, etc. A claim raised by the Arabs, the Vatican, the United Nations, and some Jews as well. This is why it is so crucial to underscore that it is our God-given homeland. Now, I do not delude myself into imagining that these just and honest arguments will prevail in the United Nations, the Vatican, etc. Nevertheless, transmitting this truth is critical for the morale of Jewish youth living in the Holy Land, including those serving in the IDF, for Jewish American students, and for the Jewish youth of other countries as well.
You see what the Rebbe is saying? All the arguments, international law, Jewish survival, that's good for other people. That's good for the Vatican. That's good for the UN. That's good for the world. We Jews need an answer that we couldn't give two hoots what the world has to say about Israel. It has to be unshakable. It has to be a timeless answer. It has to be an inner resolve, which builds up the morale of Jewish youth. The land is ours. God gave it to us. But it only comes if Jews identify with Judaism, if Jews identify with God, if Jews identify with Torah. Jewish education, Israel education cannot happen in a vacuum. I want to put this over here. Israel education is the second layer. The first layer has to be that Torah and God are exciting, relevant, and meaningful. When you have that, then you could teach Jews what Israel means to us. And then Jews will identify with Israel. Jews will be proud of Israel. Being proud of Israel does not mean that I support the government necessarily. Every few years, every few months, there's a new government. It doesn't mean I even have to support anything that anybody ever did. Believe me, the early Zionist founders were very flawed people. Doesn't matter. It's not the point. And no one's saying that we can't debate the issues. Maybe Israel should be doing certain things differently. Of course we could debate that. Of course we should discuss that. I think Israel could be doing a lot of things better. But they have to identify an inner confidence. This is my land. This belongs to us. This is meaningful to me. I'm not going to stab Israel in its back. I'm not going to undermine its existence, its security. And I think this is the call of the hour for all of us as a community. Jewish education, authentic, real Jewish education, not fake, not fluff, real Jewish education that will give youth a connection to Judaism, a meaningful, exciting, and relevant connection with Judaism. And from their support to Israel will flow on its own. And that's what we all have to do. We all have to put our efforts into education, educating ourselves, educating our children, supporting real educational institutions. That's really what it's all about. If you want to know how to outsmart anti-Semitism and this unique problem, this is the Jewish answer. And dear friends, with that, we conclude today's class. Next week, and I just want to give you the heads up, next week is our last class for this course, and we'll finally talk about how do you deal with anti-Semites. We spoke a lot about the problems. When we encounter an anti-Semite, a political leader, somebody in your office, what is the Jewish way of dealing with the actual anti-Semites? That's next week, and looking forward to seeing you there. And I want to get some conversation going. All right.
So why isn't this what we're talking about? That it's been, the land Israel is God given to us, and why isn't that recognized?
Not
by
recognized by
anybody?
who?
Well, by the UN, by the Arabs, by the Palestinians.
So listen. So the UN. Not necessarily could we expect that a religious argument is going to prevail among the nations of the world. Maybe yes, maybe not. But the idea is, and the focus of today's class this was an internal conversation, Jewish youth. That's the real question. Why are we not focusing on these ideas when we speak to Jewish youth? Because this is ultimately the only real legitimate answer, the timeless answer, unshakable answer of the Jewish connection to the land of Israel.
But what about the fact that it was the first thing that we talked about out of the three was international law, the Balfour Declaration. Why isn't that recognized?
It is recognized. We spoke about that. Yeah, technically Israel's legal.
Yeah,
The
but
argument is that Israel's immoral.
People don't know that. I don't think.
And the international law is immoral. That's not the point. That argument's not going to help the cause, right? Make sense to it?
I think it's where the education is going to help Jews from being apostates. I don't think it's going to convince anybody on the negative side at the UN.
Yeah, we're not talking about the UN. The UN is a different strategy. UN is next week. We're talking about Jews, talking about Jewish youth.
So I think it'll work for, it'll help Jewish youth. And that's most important.
Exactly. Exactly. Most important thing is Jewish youth, because when Jews are strong in their morale, it's much more difficult for the anti-Semites to pick on us.
You need the right instructors and educators to be able to teach the young people. How many of them do we have? And like Dr. Joel was talking about with grandchildren and so on, learning in college, and they're feeling the anti-Semitism within their classes. So
It's a big problem. It's a big problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know what? One step at a time. And it's really all about educating the educators, educating ourselves, because we are all also leaders. You know, there's nobody who doesn't have a role to play in this regard. We are all people of influence. And it's also for us. All of us should, you know, it's a personal question. Why do we care about Israel? You know, is it just because I was raised that way? Is it cheap or is it deep? Is it real? And, you know, it's a question for us as well. You know, is Judaism, is Torah, is God a very meaningful thing in my life? You know, meaning anti-Israel sentiments amongst Jews is not an Israel problem. It's a Judaism problem. You understand? The anti-Israel part is only a symptom. There's only one expression of the deeper problem. The problem is, you know, we have Jews over here who simply don't identify with Judaism. And that's we need to change that. We need to change it. That has to be the focus.
Rabbi,
yeah,
as well as sending the kids to Cheder, to Hebrew school, I think it's as well as any other education, you need a lot of parental input.
For sure, for sure. Takes a village, as Hillary Clinton said.
They teach parents how to parent children. Like in young children, I should say the parents of young children many times will take parenting classes. Perhaps there should be some classes for educators or seminars with people like you who come in and actually educate them and tell them how they can pass on the knowledge to their students.
Yeah. I appreciate the compliment, Julie.
Well deserved, Rabbi.
Yeah.
I mean, you're right.
Rabbi,
Listen, this is.
Don't you feel it's multi-generational where this started? That parent, you know, that American Jews or Jews that came to America wanted to assimilate, and they didn't raise their children with enough education about Judaism?
Listen, it's easy to focus on the problem. It's also easy to fret about how big the problem is. But I don't think it's gonna do us any good to just you know, harp that issue more. You know, I think we all know all good and well that we could have done better. And the question now is not what we did wrong then, but how are we going to make tomorrow better? How are we going to make things better for ourselves, our children, our grandchildren? What could we be doing? What could we be doing? I think
we're doing it already by taking the class.
Exactly. That you should know. I tell everybody the best thing you could do for your own family is them seeing that learning about Judaism is a priority. That 7:30 to 9 o'clock at night, I could be going to bed. I could be watching a TV show. I could just be doing something else, and I take energy and brain power to study Torah. There's nothing more powerful for a child to see. Not only young child, but adult children as well. I absolutely agree with you, David. I think it's vital, especially young parents. And it's hardest for young parents because it's so busy. And
how do you get the young parents to be interested more in in Judaism or whatever? They're the ones raising the young, the young children who are going to be our leaders and who are going to care about, Israel and Judaism and all of that.
So that's what it's all about. We have to reach out with love. We have to reach out with care. We have to give them opportunities, comfortable opportunities, meaningful opportunities. And that's what's happening.
Each person is different, Rabbi, and each person looks towards his religion in a different way. You can raise 3 children from the same family, and each takes a different route.
Yeah.
You just hope that in the end, what you do, that they think about as they get older, they have the desire to learn more about their religion.
Listen, here's what I really think it boils down to. When you meet a Jew who's anti-Israel, so often, and I know too many people like this, they have like this very, very powerful knee-jerk reaction to scream at them, to guilt them, to call them names. And I think what this class tells us, when you meet somebody, a young Jew, an adult Jew, anybody who who identifies with the haters, with the anti-Semites, you know what you have to do? You don't judge them. It's not their fault. It's not their fault. They weren't given the right education, the right. Invite them over for Shabbos dinner. Give them a good exposure to Judaism. Give them opportunities to identify more with Judaism. That's the whole thing. There's a lot of work to do. That's for sure. The work is not easy, but the work is expected of us, and therefore we could succeed. We just got to work.
Thanks for all your hard work.
Yeah, thank you, Rabbi. This was.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thank you so much.
Good night.
Have a good
Good
night.
night, dear friends.
Good night.
And we'll see you all soon.
Sounds
Take
good.
care.
God bless you all. And we only have good news.
Right. Amen. Yeah.
Amen.
Thank you.